Yes, ma'am. Thank you. I guess before we really get started with class, the bell did ring, but there's a few pizzas left over there and some cookies. So if anybody wants anything before you head out, you can take a box of pizza, take some cookies. We need those to be gone when everybody leaves, so grab something on your way out if you would like. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to present a class to y'all today. I feel a little inadequate with some of the people in the room. You know, a lot of y'all could probably present this better than I could, but again, I appreciate the opportunity, so thank y'all for having me. Continuing on with our study through the book that was called, or is called, 12 Words of Christianity. The word that I selected is grace, and that lesson in the book was written by B.J. Clark, as the individual who presented that at Polishing the Pulpit. I'm not really going to follow through his lesson there as it's spelled out in the book. If you have the book, you can read it. There's a couple reasons. I guess one is just it's hard for me to read somebody else's material and present it in the way they wrote it down. So I just read through it, and then I just put my own lesson together. But we are going to take a look at the word grace. We're going to take a look at just its basic meaning. We'll take a look at some passages and where it's used. But the main thing I want to focus on and get your feedback is we're going to look at examples. Look at examples in the Old Testament and the New Testament and how God applied His grace and extended His grace to people, and at times where maybe He didn't. And see how we should follow in God's example of extending grace to people in our own lives. You know, because it's not just grace from God, but we are supposed to be gracious people as well, and trying to follow after the examples that He's laid before us. So what is grace? You know, grace, I guess, by definition, we could say is a gift from God that's undeserved, and it cannot be earned. It's not based on merit or success or your ability. Grace, in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 through 9, that's just where my mind goes when I think about grace. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 through 9, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourself. It is a gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast." So we see there, I think, a very clear definition and probably the greatest example of grace. For by grace you have been saved. It's not, it says here, it's not of yourself, but it's a gift of God, not by the works that you have done, but by our faith in Him, our faith in His plan, and it doesn't say there, but our obedience to Him as well. So the grace is still a gift from God. We don't earn it by the works that we do. We don't earn it because we're good enough or because we're deserving of it. It is a gift that God has given to us. And He still extends grace to us, I think, day to day. And maybe sometimes we just don't open our eyes to it as often as we should, or maybe we're just not as thankful as often as we should be for the grace of God today. You have something?
Yes. I think grace is the highest form of agape love that God wants us to do.
Yes, sir. Very good. I like that. I like that thought. Yes, sir. Anything else just about grace in particular? Just the what it means to you. If not, we're going to jump into some examples. But anything, anybody else? If not, we're going to go through some examples. Some will be quicker than others. But I just want to start back with Noah. With Noah in Genesis chapter 6. Hopefully most of us in here recall what was going on at that time. The world was wicked. He was hurt. He was sorry that He had made man, is what we read in Genesis chapter 6. That God saw the wickedness, the wicked thoughts and intentions of mankind, and it said that God was sorry that He had made man, and He was grieved to the heart. But because of Noah's faith in God, verse 8 says, "But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord." Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And I think this is such a great example for us today because we live in a sinful world. We live in a world that is lost and dying, and many people in this world today, their thoughts are continually wicked. They have nothing but selfish intentions and selfish ambitions, and they don't care about their fellow man, they care about themselves. And we live in this wicked and dying world, but God is gracious to us to extend us an offering of salvation. Just as he did for Noah, he gave Noah a plan of salvation, a plan to save him and to save his family by building the ark. God has offered us a plan of salvation. And that, as we read in Ephesians, that's only by the grace of God that we have that salvation. Looking at another example would be Joseph. Joseph is one that, and I guess my mind went to many different places as I was looking at these examples. My first thought was grace. And I said, well, maybe that's God's mercy. Maybe it's God's forgiveness. Maybe it's other things. But I want us to try to wrap our mind around the concept of grace and how it could apply in these stories. And maybe you disagree with me, and that's fine. Maybe you say, well, that's really mercy and not grace. Or maybe it's just coincidental or circumstantial. And we can discuss those things. And I don't think any of it's matter of salvation. So if we don't agree, let's just talk about it and we'll just move on. But Joseph, I think his story is a story that's full of grace. In Genesis 37, we read about Joseph being the most beloved son, right? The son who appears to be the most favored by his father. He receives the coat of many colors. He has these dreams, and maybe we say he's boasting a little bit, but he tells his brothers about how they're going to be bowing down to him. And then there's one day where Joseph is sent out to go check on his brothers in the fields, right? And what happens when he gets out there? Oh, here comes that brother. Here comes Joseph. We're tired of Joseph and his stories, and we're going to kill him, right? And I truly believe they would have killed him. They had the intentions in their mind. They definitely had the numbers and the ability to kill him, and they had the plan to kill him. But then Reuben steps up, and Reuben delivered them. The verse says that he delivered Joseph out of their hands. I would say it was only by the grace of God that happened, because they had the full intentions of killing Joseph. And Joseph's life, his story, could have ended there in that field. And they were going to tell their father this lie that an animal had killed him, and here's his coat, and here's his blood. But I would say by the grace of God, Joseph's life was spared. And it's interesting that led him into slavery. Oh, well, he was sold into slavery. By the grace of God, he was sold into slavery? Maybe. So I guess as I was reading through these stories, I thought the grace of God may not always look like what we would think it looks like. Being sold into slavery isn't something that any of us want to have happen to us. Joseph didn't want to be sold into slavery. But due to the circumstances, that was God's way to get him into Egypt. That was God's way to fulfill a plan. And we can see God working because we can see the whole story of Joseph's life. We can see God working through these things that we may look at and say, poor Joseph, man, he was a slave, and then he was in prison. That was God getting him to a higher position, to a position in which he can fulfill his will in Joseph's life and to eventually bring the Hebrew people into Egypt and to provide for the people in that way. But I truly believe that sometimes God's grace goes unseen because of the circumstances. For example, here with Joseph. Now we know Joseph was a man of faith, and I truly believe that's why God continued to work with him. That's why he continued to have success no matter where he was, whether he was in Potiphar's house, whether he was in prison, or whether he was second in command to Pharaoh. Joseph was a godly man. And I see God extending his grace to Joseph because of that. And I see God doing that in people's lives today. I'm fully confident that God is doing that in the lives of his followers today, extending us grace and along with that mercy and love and things that we may not truly deserve, but because of our faith, he extends these blessings to us. Looking at another example would be Moses. Moses, I see grace upon grace in his life. In Exodus chapter 2, in Exodus chapter 3, Moses came into this life with a death sentence. At that time, Pharaoh was concerned about the Hebrew people. He put a harder burden upon them, and then he was still concerned about them, so he reaches out to the midwives and says, I want you to kill all the Hebrew baby boys as they're being born. Well, that didn't work. They said, well, the Hebrew wives are so vigorous in labor, and we just can't get there in time. So he goes back and he makes a decree to all of his people, and Pharaoh says that you are to kill every Hebrew boy who is born and to throw him into the Nile. And we see here that Moses, being born with this death sentence, God's grace immediately shone upon him in his life to where he did not have to endure that physical death, but he was saved and he was shown God's favor in that way. One thing that I thought about in this is that I imagine there were many, possibly, Hebrew mothers who said, well, why Moses? Why not my baby? Why not my child? Why couldn't my child have been saved? And we see that God's favor, we may feel that God's favor is not poured out upon everyone equally. And we say, well, why did their child get saved but not mine? And I could see that in the lives of these Hebrew, mothers and fathers who had baby boys who were killed. God works in ways that we can't understand. And we can't allow these things to cause us to be angry or bitter or jealous, especially within the brotherhood, but even with people around us, and say, God, why not me? I've been working so hard. I've been so diligent in studying your word and in prayer. Why not me, God? Why did my child not get spared? God works in ways that we can't understand. And it's our job to not become angry, to not become jealous, to not become bitter in these circumstances and say, why not me? Again, we have to remember that grace is unmerited. Grace is something that God could extend to anyone. It's not based on what I can do or what I've accomplished or what I feel like I deserve. So I wanted to draw that out about this because there were a lot of people around who could have in that time said, God, why not me? Why not our child? But God chose Moses for reasons that, I guess one reason we may know is it's listed later in Numbers chapter 12. Moses was more humble than all the men on the earth, is what it's written about Moses in that time. So God chose Moses for a reason, and I'm sure his humility was part of that reason. But we don't know why God works in all the ways that he does. But we do know that God does show grace and mercy on his people. At this time, he was showing grace to Moses and his family. Then what does Moses do? As he grows up in the house of Pharaoh, and he murders a man, right? He murders an Egyptian who's being harsh upon his fellow Hebrews brethren. So Moses commits murder, and he runs away for 40 years. For 40 years, he's in Midian, and God approaches him. And God shows more grace. When God approaches him and he says, hey, Moses, I need you. I need you to be my mouthpiece. I need you to go back to Egypt. I need you to save my people from Pharaoh, from being under Egyptian rule, from being enslaved there. And what does Moses say? He doesn't say, sure, God. He says, well, God, I can't do that. God, what am I going to say? God, who am I? God, who's going to go with me? God, who's going to believe me? And he has these excuses, right? And God could have said, well, you know what, Moses, I'm done with you. He could have. He could have said, Moses, I'm going to find somebody else. God knew Moses was going to have excuses. But God showed grace to Moses, and he still allowed him this opportunity to save his people, to lead his people out of Egypt. God extended grace to Moses in that time, when Moses had excuse after excuse after excuse. Again, God could have left him there. God could have chosen somebody else, but God wanted to use Moses. I think God calls us in many ways today. And I think many times maybe we have excuses. Well, I can't do that. God, I don't have the ability to do that. God, I don't know how to do that. And God says, you know what, I'm going to extend grace to you because I want to use you. And we need to have our eyes open to God's grace in our lives. We need to be thankful for God's grace in our lives, and that He's willing to use us as His instruments for spreading the gospel. Continuing on, another lesson in the Old Testament, and we'll get to the New Testament after this one. This is a lesson in which we see no grace extended. And it ties in with our next example that will come from the New Testament. In Leviticus chapter 10, Leviticus chapter 10, we see Nadab and Abihu. They're going to offer sacrifices to God, right? In Leviticus chapter 10, verses 1 through 3, it says,